Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today's topic is top liabilities for the remodeling business in 2023. My name is Liza Hausman. I'm the Vice President of Industry Marketing here at House, and I'm very excited and honored to welcome as our presenter today, D.S. Berenson. He is managing partner of Berenson LLP in Washington, D.C. This firm represents a majority of the top 500 remodelers, maintaining an exclusive national practice in remodeling and home improvement law. His experience includes the Office of Chief Counsel of the Internal Revenue Service out of New York and the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C. He serves as general counsel and special counsel to home improvement contractors, remodeling industry manufacturers, trade associations, multinational banks, and consumer lenders on a full range of industry matters. So we are very lucky to have him here today. Welcome, DS, and I will hand the baton off to you.
Okay, thank you, Liza. Well, there are a lot of topics we can talk about, but we're going to basically run through the things that we think are most important coming up for 2024. We're going to discuss the non-payment concerns that a lot of our clients are facing in the industry. We're going to talk a little about the independent contractor issue, and people are always saying, why are you always talking about this? And it's because it's the number 2 liability in our industry. It's causing a lot of problems. Number 2, right behind telemarketing on leads. We'll talk a little bit about recession risks, which is an interesting comment, as a lot of people are bemoaning the fact that we may be entering into a recession. We'll talk about class action issues, and then through here, we'll talk about some questions if things come up, or we'll save those to the end as we move ahead.
Sounds good.
So we'll start, Liza, with the non-payment concern topic. And we've been seeing generally this issue has been sort of rearing its head a little more since post-COVID started. And it's a little more complicated than people in our industry give it credit for. Sometimes this is a question about collections. Sometimes it's a question about whether or not we have a defect in our sales process, in our installation process. Do we have a defect in the post-installation process? So these are different issues. They have different causes. They have different solutions. And sometimes we need to go in and analyze exactly what we think is causing the problem if we're going to solve it. So let's take a look here at the issues we tend to normally identify as remedies to either solve concerns about non-payment issues or avoid them in the first place. Fee and cost recovery. You want to make absolutely sure that there is language in your contract that entitles you to recover your legal fees and your costs in the event you have to go after the customer for non-payment. It should go without saying, but especially the smaller players sometimes don't have that actual language in the contract. And really, what's the point otherwise? Because you can't afford to go after a customer legally unless you think you're going to have a good shot at recovering your fees and your costs. It's just a function of today's legal world, unfortunately. It's very expensive and time consuming. And even if you decide that you're not going to go after the customer, you want to have that in your contract, certainly as leverage to try to collect the balance by essentially threatening that you could recover your costs and your fees. Interest, okay? Also on your contract, you want to have the ability to collect interest on amounts that are past due. Not usury. You don't want to, if you're actually putting some sort of amount, 5%, 15%, 25%, whatever, if you're actually listing an amount as opposed to simply saying that we'll be able to recover the maximum allowable rate of interest under state law. So if you're actually going to put that in, that's fine. If you're putting in an actual number, though, make sure you're not exceeding the contract usury limit, the limit on which you're allowed to charge interest on a past due amount in your contract. So you want to have legal fee and cost recovery. You want to have interest stated in the contract. We'd like to use a substantial completion clause. This is essentially a clause in your contract that says the final balance due is going to be paid by the customer when the job is substantially completed. And then you've got to go in and define what do we mean by substantially completed. And we're generally talking about the windows being installed and functioning, the roof being installed. Sometimes, depending on the remodel job, we're talking about a certificate of occupancy or a permit. But we're basically trying to define substantial completion as the products being usable as intended. And once that occurs, we want to get paid in full. We want to have that in the contract. And the idea is that what you're trying to avoid is that never-ending job. We all know when we get into it, because if it simply says in your contract that I'm going to pay you when the job is completed, you're going to get customers out there who are going to argue the job is never completed. Okay, something isn't straight, the finagle isn't properly done, or the screen has a scratch on it, I want a whole new one, whatever it is. There's always going to be customers out there who are going to argue the job isn't completed. And they're going to try to keep either the entire balance due or a large portion of it. So you want substantial completion language in there to try to give you that leverage. And tied into that is the punch list. Now, punch lists historically have really been things that we've only seen in larger remodeling jobs. The high-end remodelers will have a punch list, and the home improvement folks usually don't. But it's a good clause to have in there, because when you get that nitpicky client who's complaining about the screen or the flange, or there's something wrong with the decking or the overhang or whatever it may be on the job, if you have punch list language in there, you can say, you know what, okay, let's go through, let's make a list of the items that you think are not completed, and we're going to value those, and you can hold back that value, but you're going to have to pay us the rest of the balance. Okay, so the punch list is very effective in dealing with those sort of nitpicky clients where you've got that never-ending job that we talked about, even with substantial completion. So those are strong items to handle the non-payment concerns before they actually occur.
And Diaz, can I ask you, are you putting kind of the terms of the process of the punch list into the contract as
yes.
well?
It's a very simple type of clause, and it says something along the lines of, in the event at time of substantial completion, you believe there are items that have yet to be done, even though the product is usable, we'll walk through the job site with you, we'll make a list, we'll value that at cost or at fair market value, and we'll hold that back off of the amount due, which you agree otherwise to pay us, and then we will address those outstanding items promptly. That's basically how that language works. Perfect. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
So then we've got what I refer to as collection cookies. And what we're talking about here is homogenizing your ability to deal with a customer in a non-payment issue. And essentially what this means is you want to have a series of template letters, 1 to 4, that go out at set times post-installation when you haven't received your funds. And the idea is that you're homogenizing your collection protocols on a job so that if the installer is not picking up a check at time of substantial completion, the first letter goes out. And it talks about the job has been completed and we're owed the money and we don't want to go into a mechanic lien. So please, you've got 5 days. After 5 days, the second letter goes out. And then the third letter. And each letter increases in tone the potential for legal action. But the idea is that you're homogenizing your post-installation collection practices with very specific letters that go out at very specific times.
That makes sense. Do you recommend sending it both postal mail and by email? What do you typically, what's required? What do you do typically?
Nothing's actually required. It depends on the level of concern. FedEx these days and certified mail is increasingly expensive. I'm a big fan of FedEx because I like to keep a paper trail as to what's going on. But if these are just, again, template letters that we're sending out on jobs that we don't think are necessarily real problem jobs, we just, for whatever reason, haven't gotten paid, I normally would just send them by regular mail. But certainly you could ramp that up with a FedEx or certified mail if you feel, but it's not legally necessary.
And do you send them by email as well, or you don't use email for these at all?
No, we would do email as well. And again, it's just to lay the paper trail and homogenize your operations, because a lot of clients, a lot of folks in the industry, however big or small they may be, simply leave this sort of willy-nilly until things happen. And you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that, as I said, at the risk of repeating, at very set intervals, we have a template letter, a cookie cutter letter that goes out, increasing in tone and volume, starting with where's the payment? We finished the job. I have to pay my people. We signed a contract. Then moving into, we don't want to have to place a mechanic lien on your property. And then moving into, we don't have to refer this to collection and so on and so forth. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
You bet. So you've implemented sort of this cookie cutter collection protocol. Then, of course, the question comes up with mechanic liens, which everybody in our industry is very familiar with. The mechanic lien process can be a little problematic. We have many clients that use it, and they use it well, and it works for them. And like I said, we often will refer to mechanic liens in collection letter efforts. But mechanic liens are a bit unwieldy. They've generally been designed to protect the labor for installers and contractors. And there are paperwork requirements depending on the state you're in, Michigan, Florida, California, versus say Colorado or Arkansas. The paperwork can be difficult, where you have to file preliminary notices with the customer before the job even begins as to your mechanic lien rights. But in some states, you don't have to do that. The mechanic lien springs into existence as soon as you do the work, and you can simply file a mechanic lien form in the event you don't get paid after the fact, for example. But there is paperwork involved, and paperwork can sometimes be problematic when we're dealing with customers, right? Sometimes we don't want to draw attention to mechanic lien issues, and we don't want to be involved in paperwork. So sometimes the mechanic lien process is a little complex for us to use, and you have to renew it. So mechanic liens don't last forever. Some of them last for 6 months, sometimes a year, sometimes 2 years. And if you haven't gotten paid by then, or you haven't sued under the mechanic lien to collect the balance due, then you're going to have to renew the mechanic lien if you can, or it's going to disappear. Okay. So mechanic liens there are pros and cons to using them depending on the state you're in. One of the options that we like is the ACH discount. So the automatic clearinghouse discount is where you have built into your contract the ability for you to automatically tap the customer's bank account and withdraw the funds that are owed you when they become due. Now, the reason I reference this as an ACH discount as opposed to just ACH is because you cannot require a customer to provide you with ACH authorization, right? You can't say, give us a copy of one of your checks. We need your bank account number. We're going to auto withdraw. You can't require that. But if you're going to offer them a discount off of the job or a little something to get them to agree to the ACH, then you've got no problem if that's in your contract and you're bargaining for it. And that can alleviate a great number of collection issues. And a lot of folks are using ACH these days, as you know. You probably have a number of ACH accounts set up with cable company, your power and light company, whatever it may be. So in the old days, this was sort of a red flag with customers. Now it's much more commonplace, and we utilize a lot. It doesn't set off any warning bells, at least for in-home sales. So we like the ACH discount structure. And then finally, for many years, we've been using UCC1s with some of our more advanced clients. I've never quite been sure why this is not utilized more in our industry. The UCC1, and of course you need to check the specific state regulations, is a filing under the Uniform Commercial Code. And it's a filing that can be done online for a relatively small fee. And it essentially places a security interest on the assets, the property that we're installing on the customer's house, be it a deck or windows or siding or a kitchen. And depending on the state you're in, as long as you have UCC authorizing language in your contract, in the event the customer defaults, you can usually go in and automatically file for a small fee online the UCC1 security interest. And in our view, it's substantially faster and easier than a mechanic lien, and it doesn't go away. So we recommend UCC1s for those clients that are having extensive issues with post-installation collection issues. But again, to go back to what I said before, you absolutely want to analyze and determine if your collection problems are simply a normal function of the changing economy and a difficult customer, or if you perhaps have a defect somewhere in the sales process or the installation process. Is there a problem in expectations with the customer? And that's what's causing this. Because if your protocols are in place and they're well performed, you should not be having an extensive problem with collections. All right, so let's move on to the number 2 liability in the industry, as I mentioned, which is the protection of the independent contractor structure. And what we call the brick wall of protection, essentially, because you have to build this brick wall around your independent contractor installers if you want to be able to defend that relationship. And like I said, I talk about this a lot. We developed protocols back in the early 1990s when this issue started becoming problematic. And if your brick wall is built correctly, you're about as bulletproof as you're going to get. I don't believe we've ever lost an audit or a class action at any state or federal level, as long as you've got these protocols in place, not even in the People's Republic of California. So you can still utilize the independent contractor relationship. You just have to do it correctly. And we're talking about the installers being either W-2 employees or 1099 independent contractors. Those are your only options. It's not like sales representatives where you can run them as W-2 employees, you can run them as 3508 direct sellers under the Internal Revenue Code. In theory, you could run your sales reps as independent contractors, but we never recommend doing that because the level of control on your sales reps is extreme, because we're telling them what to sell, where to sell it, how to sell it, who to sell it to, how much to sell it for. You cannot defend the independent contractor structure for sales reps. So you've got to look at something like that 3508 tax provision I mentioned. But for installers, you can do independent contractor or you can do W-2 based employees. So for independent contractors, what type of brick wall are we talking about? These are some of the protocols. These are some of the bricks in the wall that we want to have. I've only listed a few, and it is state specific, so you have to be careful. But certainly you want to have the written agreement with the installer. You want that anyway, because you want it to have confidentiality, perhaps a mechanic lien release. You may want to hold back fund. You want dispute resolution. There are all kinds of things you want to have in there. Certainly, you want to hire them as what we call an IBE. That's an independent business entity. Okay, you don't want to hire Johnny as Johnny under his social security number, or Sally as Sally. You want to hire Johnny's window installations or Sally's roofing company, whatever it may be. All right. You want to make sure they have their own tax identification number. You want to make sure that they are professionally licensed as a contractor. They cannot be an independent contractor running their own business if they're not licensed to run their own business. So unfortunately, that means in difficult states like Florida or California, if your installers aren't licensed as contractors, you're going to have a problem if you ever get attacked on the fact that you're treating them as independent contractors. Now in Nevada and California, that's essentially their state law. They actually have laws in place that say, if you're a general contractor, if you're a prime contractor, and you're using independent contractor labor for installation, those folks better be licensed. And Nevada is especially aggressive right now. We've been handling a number of audits out of Nevada where the state contractors board looks at that issue and immediately goes to bang a contractor for using 1099 based installers that aren't licensed. So be aware. You want to pay them per job. You can pay with one check for multiple jobs, but you want to have that earmarked. You want to have that check earmarked to indicate what jobs are being paid for. In theory, they want to work for others. Now, that doesn't mean that they are working for others. It means that they could work for others. So you want to make sure they have a web page out there. They want to have business cards out there. They want to be advertising into the public. So they're making themselves available to work for others, even though they may be fully engaged with you. And of course, you want to issue them a Form 1099. It's actually Form 1099 NEC now. The 1099 miscellaneous form really isn't in use these days. And you want to get a copy of a tax return, a cover page or two from the installer's tax return to show that they're filing their taxes with the IRS or with the State Department of Taxation, and they're taking deductions as an independent business entity. That's pretty much a silver bullet. So why do you want to have these bricks? And again, these are only some of the bricks. It depends on the state you're in. Why do you want to build the brick wall? Why do I talk about this a lot in our seminars? Because the repercussions on this issue are extraordinary. A number of states have very aggressive attorney generals, like Massachusetts, California, where they try to reclassify our installation labor. There are a lot of class actions on this issue as well, a lot of wage and hour attacks. And what happens is, if you get one installer who argues, or his or her attorney argues, that they should have been classified as an employee, and you haven't built this wall of protection, and they get reclassified, you're looking at some very bad numbers, because you're going to be facing state and federal payroll taxes, interest, penalty, workers' compensation, retirement benefits that they would have gotten if they'd been an employee, but they weren't, health and medical benefits that they would have gotten if they were an employee, but they weren't, and so on and so forth. So with one person, you can be looking at six figures right off the bat, let alone if they try to turn it into a class action. So it's a dangerous issue. And it's, like I said, the number 2 liability. So you definitely want to be watching the brick wall of protection. Okay, now let's move on to recession risks. This is always an interesting issue. I know we've got a lot of people out there that are talking about if we're going to run into a recession or we're not going to run into a recession. I have no idea. You're going to find people much smarter than me that can opine on that. But I do know this. I know when I turn on one TV station, they're saying one thing. I turn on the other TV station, they're saying something completely different. They can't both be right. So you get a lot of talking heads out there. Economics and the planning for things like recessions and depressions and things like that is kind of like driving your pickup truck by looking in the rearview mirror, right? We're trying to determine where we're going based on what's gone before and what's behind us. And there are some people who think it's not really a science. It's kind of a lot of smoke and mirrors. But if we are heading potentially into a recession, let's take a look at some things we should at least keep in mind. Obviously, homeowner defaults. You're going to be seeing an increase in what we talked about before, customers not wanting to pay. And as inflation jumps up and we see a lot of office buildings that are still vacant from COVID, meaning those office loans are going to go into default and those buildings are going to be empty, and all the businesses that are supported by them, all the lunch cafeterias and the delis and all the, there's a repercussion effect from all these empty buildings. And we're seeing, like I said, the inflation and all that. So we're seeing increase in customer defaults. Okay. We know that's going to happen. We talked about things that we can do to try to address the problem of customer defaults. We're seeing increases in rescission. For those of us that are engaged in in-home selling and are providing federal and state rescission notices, the 3-day right of cancellation, we've been seeing those start to climb up over the past 3 quarters. No question about that. Certainly, if you're selling subject to rescission, we like to use what we call a cancel rehash savings clause. This is a clause that we developed back in the late 90s. And it's a clause in your contract that basically says, if you attempt to cancel outside of the 3-day period, which is normally day 4 or 5 or 6, and we let you do that, if we let you do that, you're going to pay 15% of the contract price as damages, or 20% of the contract price as damages. Now, the purpose of the cancel rehash savings clause is not to get the 15 or 20%. It's to explain to the customer that you don't want to have to do that, because then they're just paying you money for nothing. So instead, let me come back out. Let me send my manager back out. Let me send someone else back out. Let's rework that job and see how we can improve the terms. You're attempting, obviously, to rehash, to cancel save the job. That's the purpose of the clause. So for those of us that are engaged in rescission-based sales in the home, we certainly want to have a cancel rehash savings clause in the contract to deal with increasing rescissions. Finance turndowns, we've been seeing this heavily coming in now. We knew this was going to happen when interest rates began to spike. The majority of the sales finance companies and the finance lenders in our industry are not independent banks. So they're borrowing money to provide you funds or their own funds to finance your customers. So when the rates go up on them, they have to start pulling back, either increasing rates or increasing our fees, whatever it may be. Certainly, there's not much you can do with the finance turndown issue. You can shop around with the lenders, but remember, there is no question. If you're selling 100% financing, it becomes a crutch for your sales representatives. Okay. The more you obtain a deposit and the larger deposit you obtain on any job, the more psychological commitment you have from the customer and the lower your rescission rate. Hands down, that's not subjective, that's a fact. And the sales representatives are lazy. So be careful about falling into the trap of 100% financing. Yep, you can sell more jobs with that, but you're going to get more rescission as well. And as we see in these changing economic times, the 100% finance jobs are the ones that are going to hit late rescission more often than not. Ski control, which essentially is don't get out over your skis. Be careful about that. If we are heading into recession, you want to hoard your cash, you want to pay off your debts, you want to watch the inflationary impact with your vendors, hunker down for the long haul a little bit. Don't get out over your skis with expansion and growth at the wrong time. That has burned a lot of people going back to 2008 in our industry. And as part of that, you have opportunity. If you have hunkered down, if you do have reserves, if you have watched your expansion and your growth as we head into recessionary times, you will see opportunities coming up to take over competing neighborhoods, competitive territories, competitive companies, and expand. So that when we come out of this, you're in a much stronger position. And there's been a lot of cases of clients in our industry doing that, going, as I said, back into 2008. So always keep that in mind. And then vendor patience, right? As things go more problematic, if they continue along that path, we anticipate seeing, as we always do, problems with certain vendors in the supply chain, in the direct channel distribution markets. And most people will counsel, be patient with your vendor, with your product supplier. We don't think you should be patient. These situations have a tendency to go from bad to very bad very quickly if the economic situation continues to downturn. So if you run into a vendor where you're getting product, whatever it may be, and you start to see problems, be very, very careful about continuing on with that vendor, because you may find yourself in a downward spiral, and the situation becomes out of control. So we don't counsel patience with vendors. We counsel moving to vendors that have very deep reserves and have abilities that go beyond, say, perhaps your local player. Otherwise, you can find yourself stuck. People used to say, "Oh, counselor, you're fear mongering. I deal with so and so, or I deal with so and so, and they're huge and they're completely fine." That was before the days of WorldCom and Kodak. For any of you that are over 40, we've had a lot of large players in our industry over the years that have gone under quite suddenly. Large window manufacturers and roofing manufacturers and players that were name brand can go under very quickly. You don't want to get dragged down in that wake. So be careful if your vendor relationship starts to devolve, so to speak. Okay, now we're going to turn to the number one silver bullet in our industry. We have a target in our back in the industry. We all do. It becomes a little more difficult every year. It's not 1975 any longer. And you can never eliminate the liabilities that we face, but you can mitigate them. And we've talked about this once before in another presentation, certainly. And we're talking about the class action concern. How do you avoid the nuclear issue? You can deal with most things with a checkbook, but dealing with an individual issue like an installer reclassification, customer problem, it's one thing. But if it turns into a class action, that's something completely different. All right. And now you're running into all kinds of problems with legal fees and just a huge nuclear type of concern where the numbers are dwarfing. And every month or two, we get clients in the industry that are forced out of business because of arbitration, lack of arbitration issues handling class actions. Okay. So the concept is essentially that you have a strong class action waiver built into an arbitration, if possible, and that it's mandatory. It's not mandatory, excuse me, it's voluntary. If we were to go after a customer, we're only going to go after them for failure to pay on a job, if we do that at all. If the customer comes after us, though, it could be for anything. Defective work, defective product, telemarketing issue, the installer stole my diamond ring, rescission violations. Could be anything, some of which lend themselves very easily to class actions, some of which do not. But the class action waiver, and this is just a sample of one, has to be carefully drafted, okay? And it should be tied in with an arbitration provision for best enforceability, or there should be an arbitration provision that at least accompanies the class action waiver, in our opinion. You avoid the jackpot jury awards. You maintain confidentiality in an arbitration. Is it less expensive than the court system? Not anymore. Is it faster than the court system? Not really, not anymore. It used to be, but things have changed. But you can still keep it confidential. You can avoid the jackpot juries. Juries don't like our industry. And you can, with a little luck, avoid the class action entirely, because in an arbitration, you generally cannot have a class action. Now, before you go ahead and you cut and paste this or any other type of class action waiver into a contract, you want to make sure you're checking with state law, because each state has their own variations on how you can or how you should not use this. But it will be the silver bullet that may save your company in the event you have to deal with some of the problems we've been discussing. Okay. And I think that opens up questions if we have any.
Thanks so much, DS. So much good advice there. Really appreciate all of the detail and the patient explanations. I know some of this for the larger companies are concepts they're really familiar with, but there are definitely things like the mechanic liens that we hear a lot are still relatively kind of new and not consistently applied by smaller or newer businesses. We do have a number of questions. So one is around the brick wall of protection and use of independent contractors. How important is it to follow all of the steps if I have a certificate of insurance from the installer?
Well, the brick wall is exactly that. We call it a brick wall because you could take some of the bricks out, but I'm not good enough. My attorneys aren't good enough to tell you what bricks you can take out, where the result is that the structural integrity of the wall no longer is there if someone attacks it. So you don't necessarily need every brick. And Liza, as I indicated, I was only listing about 8 or 10 of the bricks that we normally would put in place. They're normally about 20.
Okay.
The certificate of insurance issue, certainly you want to have insurance, but the certificate of insurance is really worthless for all intents and purposes. What you want to have is you want to be listed as an additional insured on the installer's insurance policy. That actually gives you muscle and leverage to invoke the insurance and sue the insurance company for coverage. But the certificate of insurance itself is nothing more than a document that says the installer is insured, or was when they gave you the certificate. And it doesn't actually give you any rights. So we're not big fans of that.
Makes sense. Thank you for that. Okay, let's see. We have another question. If my installers are independent contractors, can I still have them wear company shirts and hats?
Well, branded clothing is normally a red flag, especially with the IRS and Department of Labor in regard to control. So if you're going to want your installers as independent contractors to wear branded clothing, the way to do that is to either have them buy it from you for a very small amount of money, or have a memo in the file that the reason you want them to wear branded clothing, the reason you may be quote unquote requiring it, is for customer safety. Because I don't want Johnny and Sally pulling up in an unmarked pickup truck or wearing unmarked clothes when they show up to Mr. and Mrs. Customer's home. I don't want to scare those people. I want them to know that these are representatives of our company. And so if you couch it, if you frame the branded clothing issue as a safety concern for the customer, you can usually do that without damaging that independent contractor brick wall. That's how we like to do it.
And clarify for me, you put that in the contract, or where do you put that sort of clarification?
The branded clothing I normally don't put in the written agreement, because in the event we get hit with a class action or an attorney general investigation or wage and hour reclassification, I don't want them to see that. I don't want them to see that the installers are wearing branded clothing. So That normally will go into a separate one-page document in plain English where we're informing, Sally installer and Johnny installer that we're asking them to wear branded clothing for the safety of the customer, and we'll provide it to them free, or they can buy it for $5 or whatever it is. But we like to have that in a separate document.
Got it, for the installers. And is it something that is needed, that you need to communicate to the client as well, or just to the installer?
No, just to the installer.
Okay. Got it. Let's see, we have a question here around arbitration. Does the arbitration agreement need to be independently signed by the customer? And what if the customer doesn't want to sign it?
Well, there are some states like Maryland. We talked about always checking the state regulations. So a state like Maryland essentially will require the arbitration agreement to be separately signed. And as we see more and more courts and more arbitration forums, especially the American Arbitration Association, frowning on arbitration agreements and class action waivers that are buried in fine print, certainly if you were going to have a separate document separately signed or initialed by the customer, you're increasing your chances of having that enforced. Unfortunately, we also are drawing undue attention to it, which I don't like to do. So I don't like to be, if we're about to close a deal, I don't necessarily want to start talking about arbitration and class action waivers with the customer. But again, it depends on the state. Now, if you have a customer who has seen the class action waiver and the arbitration language, either because you do have it as a separate document or just because they've been reading through everything and they don't want to have that, I would not do the job, because the handwriting is on the wall. As difficult as it is to turn down a job when you're sitting at the table to close, you can't ask for more of a warning bell and a red flag than a customer that starts to go in and pick apart your contract and they want to take that out. Pretty sure that anybody hearing me on this is not going to agree. And when you get there, you're going to do the job anyway, and you're going to just cross out that provision. And I'm just telling you, it's a mistake, and you're going to live to regret it, unfortunately. So.
Major red flag. Yeah. And you talked about, we don't know if it's a recession. It may not be a full, definition economic recession. However, I know just anecdotally in the industry, folks are feeling a little bit of a, lessening of the backlogs, right? A little bit more of a little more difficult to generate leads and to close business. And so there is that pressure, right, to take the job, even if it's the wrong thing to do. So it's kind of good to get that reinforcement from you to stop and think maybe one more time about that job. But I know it's challenging. We have a question here. Can I use the same arbitration agreement with my employees?
You can use a similar arbitration agreement, and you absolutely should have one with your employees. No question about it. It should be in your employment agreements or your handbook or whatever structure you have with your workers. You absolutely want to have an arbitration agreement with a class action waiver. It wouldn't be the exact same one, but it would be very, very similar. There is unfortunately, as I say a lot, there's a sense of entitlement out there where workers seem to think that they're entitled to a piece of the pie that you've built. And if you don't put in that type of language, you're leaving yourself heavily exposed, because a great number of HR related claims are tailor-made for class actions because they represent a commonality. If one employee has the claim, chances are that there are a lot of employees that have the same claim, and that's your class action right there. Not always, but very often. So yes, you definitely want to have that language in your employment agreements.
And what about with independent contractors? Does that come up as well?
It should not. We like dispute resolution language in an installer agreement or a sales rep agreement, depending on the structure for the sales reps. The class action waiver, it's not going to hurt you to have it in there. We almost never, I'm thinking in 30 something years, I think we've seen 2 class actions, and it's always sales reps. It wouldn't be installers. It wouldn't be. And that's going to occur either in Massachusetts or California. But if you're not in those states, I wouldn't really be concerned about it. Again, it doesn't hurt to have it in there. You can't be too cautious these days. But for the sales reps, class action waiver is a luxury. It'd be nice to get it in there, but I wouldn't be overly concerned about it. Again, unless you're in California, we have the private attorney general actions, the PAGA actions, or you're up in Massachusetts. Those are those are hot button areas for sales rep actions. Yeah.
Got it. We have a question around how often you should revisit your contract. So often we've got someone here saying, every time they run into a new issue, it's tempting to put new terms into the contract, and sometimes they kind of, pile up. How often, and how often do laws change or business change, and how often should you revisit your contract and your contract terms?
We like to say once a year, but that's probably overkill. We also like to say that, for example, when we're creating contracts for customers, for clients, you should be able to go 7 to 15 years without having to change it as a rule. So a contract should be obviously legally binding. It should be compliant with federal and state laws governing our industry as to rescission and the home improvement regulations. It should be written in plain English. It should not be a overly legalese-oriented document, right? If your kid can't understand it, it's too complex. And it has to be non-threatening to the customer in the home, and it's got to be simple for the sales rep to complete electronically or in hard copy. Those are your goals. So it's got to have the legal protections, the operational protections. It should be easy to understand and generally easy to complete. That's what you're looking for. But ideally, it's reviewed every year. But a good contract, the review every year should be no more than 10 or 15 minutes, because the laws do not change all that frequently. There are some progressive states, and I use that not in a political term, like Maryland or California, where they're always tinkering with one thing or another. But other than that, a good custom contract really should not need to be adjusted more than once every 5 or 10 years at most.
Great. Some questions around ACH, and I'll clarify for the folks asking the question. That's bank transfer and being able to transfer funds directly from the customer's bank account in lieu of a check, right, as opposed to a credit card. Folks were asking, when you've got kind of the incentive, or you're giving the customer, a discount, for example, to pay that way. How automated is it? So, for example, within our software, you can invoice and clients can pay via ACH. Are you talking about kind of the permission to sort of automatically debit the account when certain milestones have been reached? And can you elaborate a little bit more on that payment process?
Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. So there's written language that would have to go into the contract that specifically indicates the ACH information, bank account number, the routing number, and authorizes us to withdraw the funds automatically at the stages of payment that are probably already in the contract, whether it's deposit, it's 1/3 upon delivery of the materials, it's another third upon installation, whatever it may be. The ACH language is a clause that is authorizing the specific withdrawal automatically of the funds at the trigger points in the contract where the customer is agreeing to pay us the funds, substantial completion, for example, as I spoke about before. And that authorizing language has to be in the contract, but like I said, you can't require it. So normally we want to provide a discount, 2%, 5% off the purchase price, whatever it may be, $200, specifically for the customer to agree to the expedited process of the ACH, so they don't have to be bothered with writing checks or us coming to make a collection. That's the goal of that.
And one more question along those lines, which is, does the customer have to, approve that the progress has been made, or is it just have to be documented on the contractor's end?
We normally just document it on the contract. So part of a good contract should clearly spell out when those payment threshold triggers are hit. Deposit, delivery of materials, substantial completion, for example, with substantial completion being defined on the back of the contract. And so we should be able to somewhat reasonably rely that that trigger has been hit and we are now authorized to trigger the ACH and withdraw the funds. You want to make sure that that is defined very clearly. Those stages are defined. Otherwise, you're going to get hit, with not only complaints, but potential legal action.
Got it. It sounds like a good use of a daily log where that progress is documented and shared with the client so that there's no question that that milestone has been hit. Makes a lot of sense. Terrific. Thank you so much, DS. I think that's all the questions we have for now. Again, so appreciate your incredible wealth of knowledge. I think this is going to do a lot to help folks get comfortable moving forward in the current economy. And we thank you again for your time and your expertise.
You bet. Thank you.